And now it's time for business, and it's the last day of the Davos Economic Forum being held in Switzerland. Kate Moody is there. She's going to tell us more about upcoming market trends. Kate.
Well, hi, Shona. A lot of attention here in Davos is already shifting across the Atlantic to Donald Trump's inauguration. His incoming administration has been a major source of discussion here throughout the week. Now, opinions a little bit divided. There are some, mostly business leaders, who are optimistic that having one of their own in power will actually be good for growth. Then others, mostly economists, are a bit worried about the longer-term ramifications of some of his policies, feeling that while he may give the economy a boost in the short term, the long term is much more difficult to predict. Investor George Soros among those saying that he thinks the incoming president will fail. Now, this morning, to talk a bit more about this, I'm joined by Majid Jafar, CEO of Crescent Petroleum. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. Earlier this week, the head of the International Energy Agency told France 24 that after meetings with the Trump transition team, he expected the U.S. to become a major exporter of gas and oil. Do you think that's what's likely to happen, and what effect will that have on your industry?
Yeah, I think we're already seeing, and the IEA announced yesterday, 500,000 barrels a day of increase in U.S. production. The Trump administration has said that the energy sector is going to be a big part of making America great again. But the reality is it's driven by the private sector there and by market dynamics. I think it'll continue to be a big operation. It's 10 million barrels. We're seeing some oil exports potentially, gas exports potentially. It's really become a baseline production like Saudi Arabia and other countries. I don't see huge impact from the Trump administration, though, because it's the shale revolution that's driven it. Car emission standards have been obviously important on the consumption side, and that will continue. What would be interesting on the international level is to see whether the Trump administration, as I expect it will, uses energy diplomacy as a stronger tool of foreign policy than the Obama administration did, particularly as Rex Tillerson, the new Secretary of State, most likely, comes from the industry.
So what do you make of his broader policies, what we know so far on the Middle East?
I think actually the hope for peace, at least in Syria, is higher than it might have been under a Clinton administration. If the White House and the Kremlin get on better, and Washington adds its weight to the ceasefire that Turkey and Russia have tried to put in place, that could bode well for at least stopping the bloodshed. In terms of how a peace process works out, that's another issue. But the first priority is to stop the loss of human life. I think that relations with Beijing could be more problematic. Now, whether it's just rhetoric or whether it actually turns into a trade war, which President Xi here said is unwinnable, rightly so, and how China responds not only to potential trade threats by the U.S., but geopolitical tensions, whether in the South China Sea or relating to Taiwan. So that's the key relationship, I think, to watch out for, the Washington-Beijing one.
Now, if we turn back to the energy industry, what do you think of OPEC's plans to cut back production? Do you think it'll be enough to boost prices back to the levels that companies like yours might like to see?
So I think what was unprecedented, it's not just that OPEC came to an agreement, but the non-OPEC countries. I mean, the 24 countries, more than half of them non-OPEC. And actually, the reports are that Russia didn't just join, it played a critical role in brokering the deal amongst some of the OPEC members. So that's a first for a long time, and I think that it will hold. And whether there's a little bit of not following the quotas here or there is maybe less important than the fact of the deal. So it's clear OPEC will defend the prices down at 45.50, but it's also clear once you get to 55.60 that the U.S. production starts coming in. So we'll probably be in that band for a while. The risk is we're the third year in a row of insufficient investment in exploration for new oil and gas, and that means a few years down the line we could see a real shock in prices. And in fact, here in Davos this year, it's the number 2 risk identified by the CEOs after unemployment is energy shocks, not climate change.
I was just going to ask what else you've been hearing from others in the industry here in Davos, the energy trends to look out for 2017.
So, where we are active in the Middle East, which has half the world's oil and gas, the IEA has just reported that it's the highest percentage of Middle East oil in the markets in 40 years, 35% and climbing. Our issue is not the cost of production. We're very profitable at $55. Our issue is stuff above the ground, security risks, but also governments not respecting contracts or not paying. We've had issues in Egypt and the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So it's important that the governments put in place the right investment climate for the private sector to do more, and in particular to create more jobs. I mean, that's the big issue for the Middle East, with the highest youth unemployment of 30%. And unless the government puts in place the right things, which we've called for, we announced yesterday, the Middle East companies here in Davos, making it easier to register a company, bankruptcy laws, commercial contract enforcement, otherwise we're going to be held back.
Majid Jafar, thank you so much for joining us here on France 24 this morning. That does bring us to a look at the markets. We're seeing a barrel of the international benchmark Brent trading at about $54.30 this hour. Asian markets are mixed, as Beijing said that its economy grew 6.8% in the fourth quarter of last year, slightly better than expected and in line with official targets. Now, as this year's World Economic Forum wraps up, many participants are reflecting on how to keep this meeting of the global elite relevant in a rapidly changing world. I've been speaking to Matthieu Ricard. He's a Buddhist monk, the author of a book on altruism, and also a Davos regular who's been coming here for over a decade. I asked him to assess how the past year has changed the World Economic Forum's mission and how it should go into its future. Now, people have been talking about 2016 as a year of a bit of backlash against the political and business leaders that tend to gather here in Davos. Do you think it's come as something of an awakening for them?
Well, we said that at the time of the 2009 crisis. I think basically we are making progress in civilization. People under the poverty line went from 1.5 billion to 700 million. Overall, violence has been declining for 5 centuries. But some of them, there are hiccups. A little bit moved, like when the train sort of stops and shakes you. So I think this is a challenging time. And for me, I think the main challenge is if we wait too much to restart in the good direction, the environment is going to suffer more because there are some irreversible processes, tipping points. So that's something that is more worrying.
So you think 2016, does it count as one of these hiccups for the people who come here?
And then I think 2017 would be even probably a bigger hiccup.
Now, you've recently written a book about altruism, and it's a theme that does tie into what's being talked about here at this year's World Economic Forum of responsive and responsible leadership. What's the message that you have for the leaders who are gathered here this year?
Well, if you think of the challenges of our time, there are 3 time scales. The short term of the economy, sometimes we say, this is ultimate priority. Well, there's also the midterm, the quality of life. If you are the most powerful and the richest country and everyone is miserable, what's the use? And then there's the long term of the environment. And this is a new challenge for us. 12,000 years ago, there was 5 million people on Earth. No big deal. So now, selfishness will not do the job to make those people work together for a better world. The environment is, in the end, a question of altruism versus selfishness. If you don't care for future generation, then what's the deal? We won't be there, so hell with them. But if you do care, then environmentalists can work with policymakers, can work with financial people. They have a common concept, which is consideration for others. There's no other concept that can bring them together to do something useful and constructive. So that's why altruism is not a luxury, it's not an utopian idea, it's a very pragmatic concept, and the only one that works, in fact.
And you can see more of my interview with Matthieu Ricard, plus more insight from key leaders in our special Davos edition of People and Profit online now. Back to you, Shona.
Thanks so much, Kate.